Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, and in the first segment of this episode, I'll be speaking with John Dearie, who's the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to telling people about the critical importance of entrepreneurs and startups to innovation. I first heard him speak about the subject here in Grand Rapids, where he talked about how entrepreneurship has been in steep decline for some time now. And he joins me on the podcast here to talk more about how this decline in entrepreneurship is really threatening to the economy. Then, after that, I'm happy to bring you another segment from Marie Schieber, award-winning news anchor and journalist. She speaks with several people about their jobs and the ethic they bring to their workplace every day, showing how satisfaction in your workplace has less to do with passion and more to do with a change in perspective. Also, every Wednesday when we release an episode, I also post episode show notes on Acton's blog, and you can go there to find more resources, including articles, videos, links to event registration, and more. You can read them at blog.acton.org. That's blog.acton.org. Today, John Dearie, the founder and president of the Center for American Entrepreneurship, joins me on Acton Line to discuss, as John puts it, nothing short of a national emergency. The Center for American Entrepreneurship, or CAE, is a nonpartisan research policy and advocacy organization whose mission is to engage policymakers in Washington and across the nation regarding the critical importance of entrepreneurs. According to John, in studies conducted by the CAE, startups are in decline, one of the biggest, if not the most important factors that contribute to America's economy. John, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to say it was about a few weeks ago now that I had the privilege of hearing you speak on this topic for the Grand Rapids Economic Club. And I remember feeling a bit shocked by some of the numbers that you pulled up regarding basically the rate of startups entering the market these days. And I actually have to admit that some of that may be mistakenly come from a millennial mindset. I've always thought that a lot of people have been too hard on millennials, blaming us for laziness, when I saw a lot of people in my generation taking the bull by the horns when it came to innovation in the tech startup industry, development of the sharing economy and so on. And that's not even to mention the number of breweries, coffee shops, and restaurants I see springing up here in Grand Rapids. So I was surprised to hear that, given that startups have been in major decline for some time now across the country. So can you summarize a few of the findings that you and your team have discovered regarding the rate of decline?
Sure, and you're not the only one who was surprised when you first heard that. I was shocked when I first heard it. I'm relatively new to the whole world of entrepreneurship and startups. My background for the last 25 or so years since I graduated from college has been in banking and financial policy, but I was the policy director of a financial group in Washington, and came across the research, which was new at the time, in 2009 and 2010, showing the following three things. Number one, contrary to popular belief, especially in Washington, D.C., when it comes to net new job creation, the real action, the real bullseye of that policy target is new businesses, not small. I hasten to add that small businesses are incredibly important, very important for lots of reasons. They employ about over half of the American workforce. They account for 99% of the businesses in the United States, and they're incredibly important aspect of our communities and towns. But if your focus, your policy focus is job creation, the real action is new businesses. The confusion came from the fact that new businesses, of course, tend to be small. But when the economists controlled for the age of the firm, what emerged from the data was that the bullseye of that objective is really new businesses. New businesses are also, in the phrase that's used in the research, is disproportionately responsible for the major innovations that drive economic growth in the economy. So from the standpoint of economic growth and job creation, the entrepreneurial economy is really important. But the point that you alluded to, the third leg of the stool, is that startup rates in the United States have fallen to 4-decade lows. And not only is that happening nationally or in aggregate, the research shows it's happening in all 50 states and across a wide range of industry sectors. And this is really shocking when, given all the attention of Silicon Valley and Shark Tank on TV and, as you say, all the attention given to the gig economy. But the research is very clear. It's been repeated. Groups like the Kauffman Foundation and people like Ed Prescott at the University of Arizona and Leo Haney at Stanford and a number of other people, Bob Lighton and Ian Hathaway at the Brookings Institution, have documented this 4-decade decline. So, when you understand how important new businesses are to innovation, economic growth, and job creation, this 4-decade decline, as you pointed out, as I like to say, is nothing less than a national emergency.
So when you say that economic growth comes, principally from gains in productivity, which is driven by innovation, which I actually am pulling from your testimony that you gave in 2017 in front of the Joint Economic Committee of the House of Representatives, in which you expressed your concern. So you say that basically economic growth, so this principally comes from gains in productivity, that it comes disproportionately from new businesses, like you just said, or startups. And you also say that American entrepreneurship is in trouble, with startup rates falling for nearly 3 decades, like you just said. So when you say, it's disproportionately affected, how disproportionate are we talking about? Basically, why can't the economy just rely on the growth of current businesses as they make improvements?
Sure. Well, it's definitely true that existing firms do innovate. They launch new products and services. They choose to deliver their products or services in different ways. They do innovate, but it tends to be at the margin. It's not wholesale innovation, or the terms that are frequently used are transformational or disruptive innovation, really turning the marketplace on its head. That almost always comes from outsiders, from upstarts or startups. If you think back over the last 150 years of the U.S. economy, the big innovations that really define the economic landscape over the last century and a half. The cotton gin and the steam engine and railroads and the telegraph and telephone and electrification by Thomas Edison, the automobile, the airplane, air conditioning and refrigeration, all the way up through computers, countless applications of the internet, all the way up through and including wireless communication. All of these major innovations that really popped the economy up onto a whole different dimension of growth and development, they all came from entrepreneurs. And the reason why that is that existing firms, while they do innovate at the margin, they're not terribly interested in or terribly well positioned for transformational innovation because they're heavily invested in the establishment. The establishment is their products, their services, their way of doing things. It's almost always somebody from the outside who comes in and disrupts the establishment. Think of what Steve Jobs did to Hewlett-Packard and IBM in the 80s. To think of what Jeff Bezos did to retail, with Amazon, and continues to do to retail. Think of what Elon Musk right now is doing to the automotive industry. These kinds of transformational innovations, which we know from the great work of an American economist named Robert Solow, who drew this connection between economic growth, gains in productivity, driven by innovation. The great insight, or the importance of that insight, is that Solow, with his growth theorem, not only identified the nature of economic growth, where it comes from in terms of gains in productivity and innovation, but who's responsible for that, because economists have understood for a long time that most of those really big innovations tend to come from entrepreneurs.
This next part of the story that I want to talk about is probably my favorite, because after you and your team found this out, you decided to try and find the root of the problem and answer the question that is obviously on everyone's mind right now, which is, why is this happening? And we probably, all have our guesses, whether it's overregulation, but basically there's a lot more, I would say, to this, under the surface of all of that, because you and your colleagues decided to put the question directly to America's entrepreneurs. And you conducted roundtables with entrepreneurs in 12 cities across the U.S. to ask them that very question. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I was, as I said, I was at a different organization, a financial organization. I was I was the policy director there, and in the wake of the Great Recession, you might recall, if I can take you back to around 2011 or 2012, the economy had been growing for a few years. We came out of the Great Recession in 2009, but we were growing at a very slow pace, about around 2%. The historical average, post-World War II average, is about 3.5%. So we were growing very slowly, about 2%, notwithstanding the big Obama fiscal stimulus that was done in 2009, and notwithstanding the Federal Reserve, coming in unprecedented and controversial ways, and with quantitative easing and 0% interest rates, and Congress chipped in with programs like cash for clunkers, cash for caulkers, cash for this, cash for that. So despite all of these great policy efforts, really throwing the kitchen sink at the problem, we just were not growing very fast. And unemployment was still north of 9%. In the spring of 2011, 25 million Americans were still out of work. So I was looking for new ways, new ideas to provide to policymakers who seemed to be out of ideas at that point, and started to do my homework and came across all of the things we've been talking about, most notably that rates of entrepreneurship had fallen to 3.5 or 4-decade lows. And I asked the researchers who had done the work, why, as you said, why in the world is this happening? The $64,000 question. And they said, we don't know. We have certain suspicions, certain theories, but fundamentally we don't understand it. And I thought to myself, aha, if I and my colleagues can provide any insight as to why that's happening, we can really do something potentially very important from the standpoint of policy alternatives for what to do about it. The question was how to get at it. If these smart researchers didn't understand why the decline was happening, how would we get at it? And as you say, we decided to do the very simple, straightforward way to get at the problem, and that is to get out of Washington, D.C., travel the country, and go ask entrepreneurs what in the world is going on, what's in your way. So we set up roundtables around the country in 12 states, and we hit the road. And what we learned was so consequential, so important, so different than what I knew policymakers were thinking of and aware of in Washington, that I decided to write a book about it. And that book, called Where the Jobs Are, was released in 2014. And then while I was writing that book, I realized in order to really follow through on all these insights that America's entrepreneurs had given us in terms of how to turn this decline around, how to get back to 3.5% growth, how to get back to the job creation America needed. We needed an organization in Washington, D.C. to really engage and educate policymakers and work with them on this policy agenda that entrepreneurs had given us, and that's why we started the Center for American Entrepreneurship.
So what kind of things did these entrepreneurs tell you?
Well, it was very interesting because we expected to hear different things at different roundtables because it's a very big country. It's a very diverse economy. The startup scene in Orlando, Florida is very different than the startup scene in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New York City, or Columbus, Ohio, or Seattle, Washington, all these places that we went. And yet, we started hearing the same, there were certain differences in regional emphasis, Caroline, I think is the way that I would put it, but we realized that we were hearing the same half a dozen or so major themes everywhere we went. And in no particular order, they were issues like we have the jobs, we need to fill the jobs in order to grow and survive. We cannot find enough people with the skills that we need. And this is really an indictment of the American education system and the kind of skills or lack of skills that graduates are arriving at the doorsteps of employers without. It's a criticism of our immigration policies. We don't have enough domestic people with the skills that we need. We can't augment that gap with foreign-born talent because of our immigration policies. Access to capital issues. Access to capital is always a difficult challenge for entrepreneurs, and what we heard is that in the wake of the financial crisis, it's much worse. Regulatory and tax burden, uncertainty, and complexity. And the reason why these are important is that if you think about it, when you're an entrepreneur, you're starting out, it's just you and probably a co-founder, maybe one other person. You don't have the resources for a chief compliance officer or a chief regulatory officer or a chief financial officer to handle your taxes. You as the entrepreneur are doing all of that. And to the extent that regulatory complexity and burden, tax complexity and burden are distracting you, are taking your eye off the ball being your product or service of the marketplace, it increases the chances that you'll miss opportunities, that you'll make mistakes, and ultimately fail. And then finally, we heard everywhere we went that Washington is not a source of solutions, it's a source of problems. It's the unwillingness to deal with issues, the national debt, taxes, the constant bickering, the fiscal cliff, the government shutdowns. All of these things create uncertainty that was described to us as a wet blanket on the economy, and complicating entrepreneurs' ability to launch and grow their firms. There were some other issues that we heard at individual roundtables. Student debt, for example, major obstacle to entrepreneurs and people who want to work for startups. Healthcare. The fact that most people rely on their firms, their corporations or their employers for health care makes it very difficult to leave that security and go and start a business. Childcare, very big obstacle for women who want to be entrepreneurs. So lots of issues. All of these are incorporated into our policy agenda, and we're trying to move the needle with policymakers.
So one of the things that you said in your address to the House of Representatives that I really liked was, quote, "From the standpoint of innovation, economic growth and job creation, arguably the three most important metrics of economic health and vitality. Thriving entrepreneurship is the beating heart, the very soul of any economy." I love that quote because I think in a way it brings out the fact that the economy is not just about cold numbers and cutthroat CEOs, but it's about real people providing real solutions to problems, solutions that serve both parties involved, the business and the individual. And I mean, vocationally speaking, a decline in entrepreneurship not only stunts economic growth, but hand in hand with that, it also stunts human creativity, and that results in fewer people being able to employ their unique skills.
That's right. I mean, the word that's used, and I like this word a lot as well, the word that is used often to describe the decline in entrepreneurship is a decline in economic dynamism. And that is, obviously you want an economy that is growing and developing and providing opportunity and jobs and hopefully rising wages for workers. And to get all those things, you need, if you think of the economy like an athlete, that economy has to be dynamic. It has to be strong. It has to be healthy. It has to be striking out in new directions. It has to be plowing new ground. And that analogy I used about the soul of the American economy, and that's what the subtitle of my book was Entrepreneurship and the Soul of the American Economy. That soul is, as you say, real people who are deciding to take great risks. Being an entrepreneur is risky. You're leaving probably a very stable job, a very stable set of circumstances. You're striking out on your own. You've got an idea that you think is a winner. You sacrifice, you work hard, at great personal and financial risk to yourself. Over half of startups fail within 5 years, but some of those new ventures or businesses that people launch turn into the next Google, the next Tesla, the next Amazon, and those new businesses, those new ventures that survive and then start to grow, are really the engine of job creation, economic growth, and opportunity in the economy. We rely on those. That's the American spirit. It's American ingenuity. It's everything that we like to think of. We are as a nation and an economy, and so it's a terribly serious problem that this activity is actually in decline.
Do you think that this is going to get worse before it gets better?
I certainly hope not. I am very optimistic. I mean, first of all, even though the numbers remain at or near 4-decade lows, there does seem to be a slight, in the recent data, there does seem to be a leveling off and even a slight uptick in the number of new businesses created. We are still missing about 100,000 new businesses each year. Historically, the U.S. economy has created about 510,000 new businesses each year. Since 2009, we've been averaging about 400,000. So that's 100,000 annually, and over the course of 10 years, that means that we're missing about 1 million startups in this country since 2009. But there has been a leveling off and a slight uptick, and more importantly, Caroline, I can report to your listeners that as we have introduced ourselves, CAE, to policymakers around Washington, and we've had, I'd say about 150 meetings with individual policymakers. I've testified in front of congressional committees, as you pointed out. We've shared our research, shared our policy agenda with folks in the Senate, in the House. As a matter of fact, we've established a new entrepreneurship caucus in the Senate for the first time. We're working on standing up an entrepreneurship caucus in the House. We have a great relationship with the administration, who reached out to us after they heard that we had launched and asked to see our policy agenda and pledged to work with us. And we have a great relationship with a caucus in the House called the New Democrats, who were sort of business-friendly, centrist Democrats who were particularly interested in entrepreneurship and innovation. So the point here is that there is a growing awareness in Washington, on Capitol Hill, and in the administration of the importance of entrepreneurship, that it's in trouble, and a real interest in what to do about it. So we're very hopeful that in the next year or two, now that CAE is on the ground, is known, and the importance of entrepreneurship is spreading in Washington, we feel like we're in a very good position to move the needle on a number of issue fronts very important to entrepreneurship.
One more thing that I want to end on, it got me thinking, because you say in your address that to meaningfully address these challenges and also the anger, cynicism, and populism they inspire, we must accelerate economic growth. And I can't help but think, it's also probably inspires a host of other ideologies, socialism among them, which we're really seeing becoming prevalent in America right now.
Yes, and that's very unfortunate for all the reasons that anybody familiar with economic history knows. But I think what's breeding that kind of cynicism and populism on both sides of the political spectrum, and now more recently you see this interest in socialism, is there is a feeling in the minds of many, many, many Americans that at least in recent years, and I would argue, going back several decades, that the economy, simply hasn't been working for enough of us to where people have lost faith with democratic capitalism, and they're looking for alternatives. It's my view, as you just said, that a large part of that reason is that the economy simply has not been growing enough or fast enough. We haven't grown. The U.S. economy has not grown at 3% or better. And remember, the historical average is 3.5%. We have not grown at 3% or better since 2005. So we're going on 14 years of subpar economic growth, and all of the associated problems with that are things like job anxiety, stagnant wages, the wealth, income, and opportunity gaps, the highest poverty rates since the late 60s, the highest dependency rates in terms of food stamps and disability ever. And this is happening, most severely among the middle class, who feel left behind, who feel like the American economy is not working for them and providing the opportunity that they need and deserve. And so I'm very much of the view that the work that we're working on to try to turn the decline in entrepreneurship around, with the ultimate goal of getting back to the kind of growth that we need to make progress on all these other fronts, this work is about much, much more than just more new businesses. It's not just about, we like new startups, they're cute, and we want more of them. It's about the country. It's about the economy being able to provide for all Americans in the way that they need and deserve, so that we can preserve this national consensus and commitment to democratic capitalism, that we're not going to make the mistake of resorting to something like socialism because we think that capitalism is somehow broken or lost its way. So this is very much about the country, about economic freedom, about opportunity, and all the things that we hold dear.
If our listeners want to learn more about the Center for American Entrepreneurship, where can they go?
They can go to www.startupsusa.org. There's lots of information there on all of our activities, what we're about, who we're working with, and I would encourage anybody to go and read that and support us if this story moves their mind and their heart. We welcome folks to get involved because it's an incredibly important issue.
John, thank you so much for your time and for joining me on Acton Line today.
Thank you, Caroline.
You're invited to an evening in Chicago featuring best-selling author P.J. O'Rourke on Thursday, March 7. You do not want to miss out on this event filled with humor, wit, and engaging dialogue. With more than 1 million words of trenchant journalism under his byline and more citations in the Penguin Dictionary of humorous quotations than any living writer, O'Rourke has established himself as America's premier political satirist. O'Rourke's best-selling books include his newest release, None of My Business, and the book will be available at the dinner for purchase and signing. Make sure to save your seat today before they're all gone, and save your spot at acton.org/events.
When people no longer find satisfaction in their job, it's called burnout. And sometimes the solution is to quit. But there is another approach, changing perspective.
The entire Western culture tells us that we are working so that we can go have fun and rest.
That's Melissa Wallace. She too felt burnout, trying to find meaning in her job in the corporate world.
And I jumped to the nonprofit sector thinking I was moving up in God's hierarchy of work. That surely if I did something better for the people, I would be doing something better for God.
While she was waiting for that aha moment, something happened in her family life. Her daughter was diagnosed with a serious illness. And as she turned to her faith, spending time reading scripture, she would see plenty of references to work, and she
had it all wrong, and that actually everybody can be on the A team for, God's hierarchy of teams. Everybody's on the varsity. There is no junior varsity of different types of work in terms of serving God.
In other words, we shouldn't expect work to give us this warm, fuzzy feeling. Rather, we should celebrate it as an end in itself, something God modeled for us to do.
He took chaos and brought structure, called it good. And really any kind of work we do, from unloading a dishwasher to being the CEO of a company to trying to take out an appendix, those are all taking chaos and bringing structure and trying to call it good.
Maybe workers ask too much of their jobs, like expecting employment to fulfill some kind of passion. That is bound to lead to disappointment because job fulfillment is never linear. Wallace formed an organization where she's based in Tennessee called the Nashville Institute for Faith and Work.
To help individuals and organizations think through their faith and their day-to-day work in a way that incorporates the gospel as part of their understanding of work and leads to greater flourishing for all in Nashville.
Which brings us to this man.
This is where I live.
He's not from Nashville, but instead of giving up on his profession, he decided to have two of them.
My name is Craig Varecki. I am an engineer by trade and a pastor by calling. And my mission in life, at least at this stage, is to help especially men who are struggling with homelessness and addiction and get them on a path to recovery.
If work is taking chaos, giving it structure, and calling it good, Craig Varecki is doubling down. Engineers, for example, solve design problems.
A lot of times that will start off working with a designer, literally drawing things on a napkin and, in a conversation like this. This is my idea and what I want it to look like. The engineer takes that sketch and turns it into 3D models and then drawings, which we can then begin to manufacture those parts from.
Pastors can bring structure to spiritual chaos.
So sleeping under a bridge is, based on their decision to use their drug.
When Varecki is not in his engineering job, he's often leading a 12-step program to help men, many of them homeless, get on the path to recovery. He walks the streets in his urban neighborhood, and because he's trained as a pastor to do this, he will strike up a conversation with someone who appears to be struggling.
Most of the time what they want is money, and I usually make that statement right up front when I talk to them. I don't have, and I usually don't even carry money on me if I'm just out about walking like that. But I do love to hear their stories, and if they're willing to sit down with me, over coffee, over breakfast, and give me an opportunity to get to know them, hear their story. Because most of those people, rejection after rejection after rejection, whether it's when they're panhandling, asking for money, and people just driving by or pushing them off to the side, I don't want to talk to you. These people have been rejected most of their lives and don't have any friends and are living in total isolation. What they really need is to know that somebody cares.
Varecki admits he went to seminary school because of the burnout he felt years ago as an engineer when he worked a stressful job in the auto industry. When he went to seminary school, he became convinced that engineering was the wrong profession for him.
Yeah. You didn't think you could reconcile that you could maybe find God's purpose through engineering or serve Him through engineering?
Yeah, and I think I've tried that in a lot of ways over the years in the different engineering jobs I've had, and it's never been totally fulfilling. There have been opportunities where I've gotten to share my faith, but not in the sense that I feel called to as a pastor. And I still have that today, and that struggle goes on all the time because I have an employer who's paying me to work 40 hours a week and wants me to, be very efficient and get things done.
Yeah.
But here's the part Varecki doesn't readily acknowledge. He's still an engineer. His engineering skills help him as a pastor, and his ministry work helps him in the office. He thinks it's a role that is much in demand in today's workplace setting.
In many of my jobs, I've witnessed situations with employees where there's been conflict or they've had to do discipline with an employee for various reasons, and those are always just hard, awkward situations for both the employee and the employer.
Right.
I've seen situations where they've had to call the police to come in just to be present there when somebody is told they're going to be released because they don't know what that person's going to do, Yeah. Having a chaplain there who could maybe bring a softer side to those kind of situations. Somebody who the employees already know because this person either visits there frequently or works alongside them every day and they have a relationship with.
You definitely bring that part of your life into the workplace. Now, do you see it working the other way around when you are ministering to people? Do you ever feel like your engineering brain gets into that equation?
And right away, my problem solver brain wants to interject and say, well, just stop and do this. Help them fix their situation. And what I've learned through 12-step groups is that listening is a whole lot more important than speaking advice to people.
So there you have it. People make peace through their work. Jobs can feel futile at times, but there is some perfect order that keeps us going. You don't have to start a nonprofit. You don't have to become a pastor. Making peace with your vocation comes from within. For Acton Line, this is Marie Schieber.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're always trying to make a great show for you, and one of the ways in which we can do that is to use feedback from you. We would love to hear from you, whether you'd like to suggest a specific guest or topic, let us know what you like or dislike in our shows, or just generally let us know why you like listening. You can shoot us an email at actonline@acton.org. In addition to that, we're trying to create a new occasional segment for the show. If you have any questions related to a subject we've covered on this podcast before, or questions related to economics, faith, business, or maybe a current issue you'd like to hear discussed on the podcast, leave us a message at 888-705-4180. If your question is picked, you'll get to hear it on the show, and members of our team here at the Acton Institute will break it down on the podcast. Last but definitely not least, if you like Acton Line, please subscribe today. And don't forget to share it with your friends or family members who might also enjoy listening to this podcast. We're available on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. This episode is produced by me, Caroline Roberts, with audio mixing by Doug Nagel.